Hello, this is Hushain Amir Ahmadi, a distinguished service professor at Rutgers University and president of the American Iranian Council. As I said in the past, this video comes to you very informally. No written text, no teleprompter, just off straight from my mind and heart, and of course, knowledge and experience. I specialize in international economic development, and my understanding of foreign policy really emanates from the many sides of that particular discipline, which I believe they are very much interconnected. International economic development and international relations are inseparable. They are two sides of the same coin. In the past, and that is the last video, I focused on US capitalism and I spoke about its possible trajectories in the post-corona period. I spoke about trends. In this particular video, I will be still speaking about trends, but focusing on international relations of the United States in the years to come. So predictions are predictions, and I don't guarantee that they will all come true, but I can tell you I have been good at predicting. Those of you who know me know that I have done this well in the past. But before I get into US's international relations in the years to come, let me take you back a few decades very quickly and tell you where the US stood and how that particular stand evolved into what it is today and what it then becomes tomorrow. America largely was an isolationist state until World War II. More or less, not that it didn't intervene anywhere, but interventionism wasn't its really driving force for foreign policy. It was isolationism. America was too big, too isolated geographically from Europe particularly, which was the continent then. And therefore, it also was big enough, self-sufficient, didn't need anything beyond its borders to live and have fun and grow fast. World War II dragged America into the international scene. For the first time, Americans gradually became interventionists. In fact, even then, for many years, and it still continues, there is a debate in this country whether America is best served following an isolationist foreign policy or an interventionist foreign policy. Of course, there has been periods where either of the two have dominated, but I would say after World War II, America has largely been an interventionist state. And one reason for this was, of course, World War II and the fact that America won that war. The fascists lost, America won, but of course the communism also won, the socialists also won, that is the former Soviet Union. And the world, as a result, got divided between the two superpowers that emerged, the US and the former Soviet Union. And immediately afterward, a Cold War ensued between the two that really changed American foreign policy culture significantly. It made America increasingly a national security state, a national security state that was very much preoccupied by its rivals and enemies outside its borders. Very different from what America was preoccupied with before the World War II. As I said, it largely stood within itself on its own feet and with very little attention to outside except for certain periods or times. But the World War II changed all that, and the emergence of communism as a bloc, and American increasingly became a national security state. The America also became increasingly interventionist, meaning it had to go around the world, collect allies and isolate enemies, and actively pursue a policy that weakens foes and strengthens or at least contains friends. This also meant an ideological polarization of the socialist pole and the capitalist pole. The two superpowers were also ideologically two ideological poles of socialism and capitalism. Of course, America stood on the side of capitalism. American capitalism grew extremely, fast, advanced, and also helped the devastated Europe and others to rebuild, and built enemies throughout the world, as well as friends, but more friends than enemies. Domestically also, America grew very fast. Economically, it grew very rapidly. America became a bastion of scientific and technological development. It also strengthened its political and strategic standing in international agencies like UN and others, World Bank, IMF, and the rest, NATO. And America also, because it was so growing and prosperous, it became a melting pot of cultures. Anyone who will come becomes American, will be melted into American creed and culture. The culture of democracy, of federalism, of less government, of competitive economy, liberal capitalism, and the rest. America also advanced socially. There were problems, but they made lots of social progress. The black people were given the right to vote, the women advanced significantly, and the rest of it. American prosperity, their per capita, their income, their purchasing power had no parallel in those years. Late 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. But there were problems. Unfortunately, over the course of that development from World War II, even if America won, quote unquote, the Cold War. But it also lost a lot. For one thing, it became increasingly a national security state focused on security and political and strategic matters rather than on economic, for example, development and democratization across the globe. But also, America started losing to its competitors, economic competitors globally. In the previous video, I explained why, and the key was that America created advanced, the most sophisticated science and technology, but it let it go, and it was then commercialized by others and used to compete with America and make America suffer. Where America failed economically, perhaps, was the moment it failed to commercialize its advancements in science and technology and let others do that. For whatever reason, American economy began declining from 1/3 of the world to 1/4 of the world, and now to less than 1/5 of the world. And soon it will be not the first, perhaps the second, to China, and perhaps even India in a few years will take over America economically. That has had a devastating impact on, of course, the country. Poverty increased, inequality increased, interclass relations suffered, and those who were on the top of the economic ranks made more and more, and those at the bottom of the hierarchy lost more and more. So there's class divide, economic divide grow over time as America lost to its competitors, as America failed to commercialize its science and technology. And America lost because it failed to grasp the significance of these developments. It took it for granted that America will always be number one, that America has unlimited resources, that it can do what it wanted to do. But that was wrong. That didn't happen. So as American lost economically, at least relatively, they also began losing socially. They also declined socially. Social divisions began widening. Now, the social division here is not just the division among classes, the rich and the poor, but also among ethnic groups, racial groups, genders, and so on. The fact is, the economic decline was more suffered by those racial groups at the bottom of the hierarchy, the Black, the Hispanic, and others. And so the poorer groups became increasingly Black and others, while, again, or they were the working class of the white, and the rich was rich, either Black or white. But largely, this economic decline made those minorities suffer more. America used to be a place where, as I said, different groups from all over the world will come and they melt into American culture and creed. That also stopped. The immigrants who were coming in, in great numbers stopped becoming melted into the American melting pot. They began keeping their identities. They began developing their own values and creed. They even began maintaining their own national identity in terms of the interest. Their interest was largely the interest of their home country as opposed to American or America. That was a big change from a melting pot to what then became a multiculturalism. A big change. But America also, in the meantime, as the economy was declining, as the social the differences widening, and the multiculturalism expanding, politically also, the country became increasingly divided. The divisive politics became dominant within the system. Now, it wasn't communism or socialism against capitalism. It wasn't the American elite, political elite versus the, like I said, Russians elite. It was the American elite versus the American elite. The Democrats versus conservatives. There was a time that they were divided over whether it should be isolationism or interventionism. But now it's more a pure, plain political competition, competition for power, competition for control, political control, party control. So the national security state with that national interest increasingly got diverted into a state that was fighting among its own elite within the country. It was the interest of this or that party as opposed to the American interest. Unfortunately, that continues. America began losing its national interest to political parties that continue doing the same. America has always been a nationalistic country, but unfortunately, or I don't know, after World War II, because of this American new interventionism and the Cold War, America increasingly got dragged into globalism. And of course, the capitalism also became increasingly global, international trade and international finance and banking system and the rest. And that eroded American localism, parochialism, which dominated in this country before World War II. And that was the basis for isolationism. That has also changed. So this, with the interventionism, with this Cold War, America got increasingly global, and globalism got dominant next to multiculturalism, next to growing international competition and declining, relative decline in the economic side, which I said largely was caused by the American failure to commercialize its own science and technology. But it has developed. Others got it and commercialized and sold it to America. Now, so in the one hand, you can see a country that, although won the World War II and but at the same time became global, interventionist, and so on, but gradually began suffering from that very globalization and internationalization and lack of attention to domestic. And so its economy, its political, social, cultural systems began declining and becoming increasingly diverse and it's in a sort of uncontrolled. This two developments, in the one hand, internationalism and globalism, and then at the same time a decline in the economic side, led America to something that often is called the imperial overstretch. America became overstretched. That when in the World War II has given America lots of obligations to friends, to the maintenance of the global capitalism and the rest of it. And at the same time, those friends and those others who were under the umbrella of the American capitalism as a whole would not pay for the expenses. America became obligated economically, financially, and in many ways to maintain that whole system that was under it. That was too much, particularly for an economy that was not anymore as competitive, as growing as it used to be. And at the same time, allies and friends who had become smarter and and they really were using America, abusing America from Europe, in Asia, everywhere. So this imperial overstretch was increasingly felt, and in most recent decades, and particularly last decade, it became very obvious that America may not be able to sustain that level of interventionism and that it is too stretched to keep itself together or keep even the allies together with it. So these developments led gradually to the emergence of a very tough American nationalism, a very radical American nationalism, and that increasingly growing towards an American national fascism. Very, very concerning, but one can understand why the America should move in that direction. I understand it. America lost because of its internationalism, and now is reacting to that loss and internationalism in terms of a return to nationalism, parochialism, and to make sure that it doesn't pay for others and that others pay at least for themselves. I think President Trump is the product of that understanding, that his anti-globalism, his anti-immigration policy, all of this is very much a direct consequence of what happened to America over the last 2-3 decades, particularly recent decades. Now, with this, let me say also that America was not just globally speaking in terms of foreign policy. America, of course, as I said, became interventionist, and it became quite stretched across the globe. It supported globalism and so on. And its foreign policy, too, reflected those developments. Isolationism increasingly lost. American unilateralism increasingly lost to global multilateralism, like multiculturalism, like some other multis, that were promoted by the UN and others, multinational agencies and firms and so on. So American gradually became a multi-something. Other countries and other groups, cultures used to melt into America. Now America was melting into the globe, and it has increasingly melted out of. Now, neglecting domestic and being preoccupied by national security at the global level, multinationalism, multiculturalism, with multilateralism, with globalism and so on, made America to suffer. Domestic, particularly, as I said, situation, eroded. Now, from all this, one can see what could happen moving forward. I believe Americans are increasingly rejecting and will further reject what has become known as globalism. Mr. Trump has already done it to a large extent. I think Americans are going to be increasingly becoming isolationist as opposed to the interventionism of the post-war. America will become increasingly nationalistic. It will increasingly become unilateral. Unilateral in the sense that it will increasingly collect and come home. And whenever it enters into international scene, it will enter there selectively, by mean only when and if that will serve American domestic interest to begin with. It is the American domestic interest that I believe will become very important in American foreign policy. American foreign policy was based on domestic developments, but gradually it actually got isolated from it, and the American foreign policy became a thing of its own, something flying up in the air, with very little relation with its economic and sociocultural basis at home. And now that flying bees is going to come back home and sit in its local context. That parochialism will certainly lead not just to an isolationism in international relations, but also isolationism in the sense that it will reject whatever that will not be in the best interest of domestic. That is the main change from considering American national interest in relation to its national security state's situation globally. Americans are going to increasingly redefine their national interests domestically in terms of what is good for the American people, American land, government, its culture and way of life, as well as its global standing. That's where America is going to be in the foreseeable future. This means that both less contact with the world, but also whenever there is a contact, it will be very nationalistic. So this is not just your average interventionism then. Whenever you intervene full extent, or you don't. I believe American domestic situation will change significantly as this new thinking about domestic and international come together. I believe American federalism, democracy, and many of this kind of stuff are gonna to suffer. Unfortunately, we still in this country face a divide among political elite. Conservatives and Democrats are increasingly, in fact, to my surprise at least, increasingly propagating that divide as opposed to trying to close it, to close that gap. This coming election is going to be a major show of that divide and further divide, unfortunately. That would be a divide between interventionists and isolationists, between nationalists and globalists. And it will be an ideological divide as well, that who cares for the people or who doesn't care for the people, who cares for what race and who doesn't care for what race or class or gender. But this is the wrong direction for America. America must stop moving in that direction. The political parties must come together as a unified force to build America again on a nationalistic basis, globally, staying interventionist only selectively, and I mean selectively. Isolationism will serve America much more better than American interventionism did. In fact, America was the product of its isolationism. And after World War II, yes, for a few decades, America grew, but then it lost. It needs to return home, sort of. This flying bees has to come back home and sit in its local context. That's what I believe is going to happen. So American foreign policy is going to be very much redefined in relation to enemies and friends, adversaries or allies. Allies will not be given a blank check, for sure. And enemies will not be considered enemies forever. If an enemy serves your domestic, it's your friend. And as a friend that doesn't serve your domestic is your enemy. That's how American foreign policy is going to be reformulated. There is no such a thing as a set friend or enemy. What is set is your national interest, and your national interest has to be defined in relation to your domestic advancements. Your national interest is served when your domestic economics, cultural, political, and social systems advance. And upon the countries that you consider your allies have to serve that advancement. Otherwise, no allies. That's what the bottom line is. So I think there will be a tremendous redivision of the American world in terms of who may emerge as allies, who may emerge as enemies. I believe many of the present allies will no more be allies, and many present enemies will not be enemies in the past, in the future. There will be a complete redistribution of this global map for American capitalism and American foreign policy as well. America's problem with China, later on, very soon with India perhaps, with Russia, with other Latin American countries, they all will have consequences for American domestic. And therefore, American domestic and what really happens to American domestic situation in all of those areas will be the yardstick for Americans to redefine foreign policy in relation to other countries. My hope is that this country comes together, comes home, takes care of its own home, and for a while stay global only in a selective way. Whether American likes it, don't like it or not, whether I like it or not, whether you like it or not, I think is irrelevant. My prediction is that will happen regardless, that America must and will return home. America is not the first empire, the global power that had to make that choice at some point. Britain did in 1970s, and before that, Russia did recently, and every other countries in the world have done it. Every other imperial power have done it, and those who insisted to stay the course, they were wiped off the earth. They just lost, they just disappeared. America is a great country. It has probably the best minds in the world, and I'm sure they will find a way to stay big, powerful, but then again, they have to return to domestic. That's the key word. Global doesn't serve them to the extent that it did serve them for a few decades and then got turned against them. Domestic will never turn against you. That's the good part of it. Domestic is always yours. Global is not. There is time that global is for you, at times it's against you. But your domestic is always yours, will never turn against you. And that's the lesson of history. And I'm sure America can understand that. Okay? Wish you best, and I will continue this discussion with you, in the next video.